ethics of Wall Street investment firms. This is an hour and 5 minutes.
Ken Schatz, I'm professor of political economy here at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. This event featuring Greg Smith is co-sponsored by the Center for Ethics and Society, which has a year-long series of seminars on the ethics of wealth. So there are other parts of that seminar series that you may find interesting. I think they have Emmanuel Saez coming in next Thursday or something like that. So this is something that may be of interest to you going forward throughout the year. Before we get started, I want to say a few logistical things, actually. First of all, Greg is actually doing at the Stanford Bookstore an event at 6 p.m., so if you have detailed conversations you want to have with him, that might be the appropriate forum for that. Secondly, this actually is being recorded by C-SPAN, so this is for future broadcast on C-SPAN. So just so that you know, if you're asking a question, you may wind up on television doing that. And because of that, logistically, we have microphones for Q&A. So Greg's going to talk probably for about half an hour, and then he'll do some Q&A. So if you have questions, once he gets to Q&A, head to a microphone, and he'll call on you. Okay, in terms of introducing Greg Smith, so Greg came to Stanford from South Africa in the late 1990s. He graduated from here in the class of 2001 and immediately went to work for Goldman Sachs. As you probably know from reading the New York Times, he resigned from Goldman Sachs last March in a rather high-profile way that a lot of people argued about, and frankly, a lot of people around the business school here have argued about. I think, in some sense, his core point that he was making was that Goldman used to be sort of a long-run, greedy type of firm in the sense of trying to build his long-run profitability by serving client interests. But Greg's argument was that that had changed something in the operation of Goldman so that, people were more focused on their personal success or the success of their subunit or, profits that they could make in the short run, either via proprietary trading or commissions or things like that. So this is a topic and an op-ed that was fairly controversial here in the GSB. I hope that we can have an interesting dialogue between Greg and people in the audience who probably have all sorts of different views on this question. So welcome back to Stanford, and we'll look forward to hear what you have to say.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Schatz. Can everyone hear me okay? Is that a yes? Yeah. Okay. It's a great privilege for me to be back at Stanford. Like the professor said, the first time I ever came to America was actually the day I arrived at Stanford. So I associate Stanford with a lot of great things, a lot of idealism, a lot of optimism, and it's also great to see a lot of familiar faces. I think there are 3 or 4 people here from my freshman dorm, which is terrific. So for the students here, I was sitting where you were about 15 years ago, although the business school didn't look like a hotel back then. It looked a little bit less fancy. But few things I'll tell you about myself before I start. The one is I am from South Africa. But I have a slightly funny accent because I lived in California for 4 years, New York for 10 years, London for a year and a half, and I'm originally from Joburg. So when people ask me where I'm from, I often tell them I'm from Brooklyn just to confuse them, which when they get quite confused and say, really? I say, yeah, from East Brooklyn, and that confuses them even more. But I hope everyone can understand me. Other thing I would say is I used to have a ponytail, which is also hard to imagine. And the third fact about me is I started out at Stanford as a pre-med, which, I started the economics track and the pre-med track at the same time, but ultimately I decided to go into the business world. But just to get a sense for the audience, can I just take a quick poll? Who are undergrads in the audience? And business school students? Very nice. And members of the community? Faculty? Oh, great. Okay, so we have an excellent and diverse audience, and certainly I'm looking forward to a good dialogue because I think people are very split on a lot of these issues. So a couple things I'll say at the start. Professor Schatz mentioned, obviously, I wrote this op-ed about Goldman Sachs, but everything I say today, I very much believe is true to the industry more broadly. I don't think Goldman definitely is a smart firm and an excellent firm in what it does, but I don't think its practices are very different in a lot of ways to the industry more broadly. So, when I wrote the book and I wrote the op-ed, I was using my career there as a prism to what I think has become conflicted in the industry more generally. The second thing I would say before I start is I think a lot of people would want to classify my views or this talk as in the Occupy Wall Street camp or in a different type of camp. What I would say is I'm very much a capitalist. I just have the view that free markets imply that the playing field is fair and there aren't lots of conflicts of interest. And a big thesis of my book, and what I was trying to get across in the op-ed, is the fact that capitalism, at least in the financial industry as it's going on now, I no longer think is on an even playing field. I think advantages are stacked in favor of banks and against their investors and clients in many respects. And I think there's maximum incentive for the system not to change. And I'll get into this a little bit more later on. But let me tell you the three things I'm going to discuss today. The first is, has anything really changed in the industry? Certainly, when I wrote the op-ed, a lot of people said, well, things have always been this way, or Wall Street has always operated in a certain sense. So I'm going to tell you how, at least since I was sitting where you were 15 years ago, in my opinion, things have changed. The second thing I'm going to tell you is, with all these changes, how do banks exploit conflicts of interest to make money in a way that I view as unfair at best and potentially very systemically dangerous to society at worst. And the third point will be a little bit about what needs to change in order to fix this and why hasn't enough changed. And just on that point, I would ask, how many people in this room have heard of the Dodd-Frank Act? How many people think the Dodd-Frank Act has been implemented? So 4.5 years after the crisis and 2.5 years since Dodd-Frank was passed, less than 1/3 of Dodd-Frank has been implemented and more than 3/4 of the deadlines have been missed, and $400 million has been spent lobbying against it. So I want to touch a little bit at the end about this perception that conditions have changed and really try to show you guys why they haven't changed as much as I think Obama or Romney or any number of politicians would want people to think. So starting with the point of what has changed. So I think absolutely there have always been practices on Wall Street that are not great and that are dubious. But what I would say, the simplest way to mark what has changed is look how banks make their money. So when I joined the firm in 2000, or let's just say when I joined Wall Street, at least half the money was being made in the original things that made finance get called finance. Wall Street financed things. They helped companies raise money. They advised companies on merging. They acted as an advisor in all sorts of capacities. So when I joined, about 60% of Goldman Sachs' revenue was in the banking side of the business, where certainly there are always going to be conflicts, but there are less conflicts than in the trading side of the business. So fast forward to 2007, close to 80% of the money is being made in the trading business, which is a very marked change, which I don't think people can debate as being non-factual. But what that kind of revenue change does is it leads to behavioral changes and cultural changes. So what occurred that allowed this revenue shift to change? Three main things occurred right around the time when I was joining Wall Street. The first thing, in 1999, there was a thing called the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated commercial banks from investment banks. It was repealed. In 2000, there was a thing called the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, which essentially took complex securities called derivatives and deregulated them. So allowed the trading of derivatives to move off exchanges, basically into the dark. And the third thing that happened was a thing called the net capital rule was overturned. And what that did is it allowed banks to increase their leverage from, now leverage, for those who don't know, is basically if you have $1, you can effectively lever yourself up by taking bets 10 or 20 or 30 times the amount with the $1 you have by borrowing extra money. So from the early 2000s to the mid 2000s, banks took their leverage from 5, 6, 7 to 1 up to 35 to 1. So with these three things, which were all regulatory in nature and which were all ultimately lobbied for by the banking industry, it became very clear that, as the professor said, the old model of long-term greedy, which long-term greedy was a motto that Goldman Sachs had for many years, which essentially said, if we do right by clients over the long term, and maybe we turn away business in the short term that's going to affect our reputation, ultimately they'll keep coming back to us and we'll have a collaborative relationship where the client is a partner and they keep paying us and they keep doing business with us because they trust us. This shifted to a model that I would call short-term greedy, which ultimately makes more profits for individuals and for the firm in the very short term, but from a long-run standpoint, doesn't serve your business well and doesn't serve the society well, because potentially you're doing business that's toxic to your clients and ultimately endangers the system, as we saw in 2008, where Lehman, Merrill Lynch, AIG had taken such huge risk that it ultimately brought the whole system down, and the government had to come in and bail the system out. So when we talk about all these regulations occurring, what basically happens is it becomes clear that it's more advantageous for the bank to start betting with their own money, because if you can take levered bets of 30 to 1, you may actually start seeing your client more as an information provider to help you bet more smartly, as opposed to seeing your client as a partner that you help make returns and earn money. And essentially, in the early to mid part of my career, I saw this cultural shift occur where the firm started seeing what the biggest mutual funds and pension funds in the world were doing and started implementing its own bets, using this information in a way that was not front-running, technically, but allowed banks to use this big picture, kind of sitting in the middle position to bet. And you can look at the evidence. Goldman Sachs' trading revenues, for example, in 2002 were $5 billion. By 2007, it was $38 billion. And businesses don't multiply by 5 or 6 times in 5 or 6 years unless there is some meaningful shift in your mindset. So ultimately, that leads to what I'd call a behavioral or cultural shift. And this doesn't happen overnight, but if people are being incentivized to use their client information or to bet with the firm's own money, and no one is telling them that there's anything wrong with that, it ultimately filters up and down an organization. And this cultural shift occurred everywhere on Wall Street during that period. Looking, just a few examples to show this mindset shift, just in the last year or so, I mean, you can count down what I'd call scandals that show this type of swing for the fences behavior. You had MF Global, which was a futures brokerage in Chicago, where the head of the firm started taking proprietary bets on the sovereign crisis in Europe, and ultimately the firm went bankrupt. There was a scandalous situation where they were potentially using customer money to fund these bad bets, and no one has been prosecuted for that. Secondly, in the last few months, we've all heard about the LIBOR rigging scandal. LIBOR is an interest rate that affects hundreds of trillions of dollars of assets around the world, and this is I would say an example of this incentive where traders were collaborating with each other to set an interest rate because they knew they'd make more money for the firm. You look at the Facebook IPO, we can argue endlessly was it Facebook's fault? Was it Morgan Stanley's fault? Was it the investors' fault? But certainly a manifestation of this, let's swing for the fences, try to get as much out of this deal as possible. So let me go into point 2, which is a little bit trying to explain how banks make this money using a little bit of an analogy, which I use in my book. If you compare Wall Street today, which 75% of revenues come from trading, to a real casino. So not everyone likes gambling, but whether we like gambling or don't like gambling, when you walk into a casino, you can have a lot of faith that the rules are not going to change during the game, and that there are cameras all over the floor, and that there is a regulatory body that, for the most part, is keeping an eye on things. The other thing I would say is the casino or the house is not allowed to take bets based on what everyone in the casino is doing. The casino is what I'd call an objective counterparty. So let's just run through this analogy a little bit. If you think about an investment bank, they are dealing everyone cards. And let's say at the table is sitting a pension fund, a hedge fund, a mutual fund, hundreds of billions of dollars of investors are sitting at this table. That bank or the dealer can see what all those people are doing and can then go out and use that information to place their own bets. Now, you would expect someone not to lose very often if you can see everyone's cards. And this is very much borne out in an example we see every quarter where banks have to release their results on their trading books for the whole quarter. There are many quarters where a bank will literally make a profit 100% of the time. So that's like batting 1,000, where if you go to the plate, you would not expect someone to hit every time. So you got to think to yourself, I'm sure most people in this room invest in the market. If you make money 50.1% of the time, you're probably outperforming many, many people in the market. It's very hard to understand how a trading book can make money 100% of the time unless you have some kind of asymmetric information advantage. And that is where I would come back to the analogy of you're essentially seeing what everyone else is doing, so you can bet a lot smarter with your own money. Second part of the analogy, when I mentioned the cameras, what happened with the deregulation of derivatives is the gambling can be taken to a back room where there are no cameras and no one is tracking who is losing a lot of money and who is making a lot of money. And this is an example of Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns and Merrill Lynch, who no one knew how much risk they had on their books. And it turned out that they had all sorts of risks that no one in the market knew or understood. And this is the big danger of business being done in an opaque fashion, in the dark, in a very complex nature. So I would argue, ultimately, you need to bring the gambling out of the dark room and bring it back into the light, or an exchange where everyone can see what's going on. To continue a little bit with the analogy, and this is what I think is the most dangerous part of the way business is done on Wall Street today, it's the dealer. Now, when you're playing blackjack, I think everyone knows the rules. You can't, if you get more than 21, you bust. There's certain statistical probabilities you should and shouldn't be betting on. When you go into a casino, does anyone in the audience expect the dealer to give them bad information? For example, a big boy attitude where the dealer is actually telling you when you're on 19 that you should be taking another card. I think no one would expect, at least when I have been to casinos, the dealer is actually kind of on your side and somewhat friendly and will tell you, because you often do see people who have never gambled before who will take another card at 19 and ruin everyone else's hands. But the dealer would likely tell you this is a bad idea, you shouldn't be doing it. So I think you have this, what I would call an implicit sense of trust, where you don't expect the dealer to misguide you. What sometimes happens on Wall Street is a client or an investor will get told to do something that if they understood the rules of the road very well, they would know is not in their interest to do, yet a Wall Street firm will tell them you should do this because that firm might make 10 or 15 or $20 million off it. And they're not technically doing anything illegal because that person walked into the casino. They are responsible for their own actions. And I think this is where a big misunderstanding comes in. And I'm sure many of you remember in 2010, there was a big SEC lawsuit against Goldman Sachs, and there was a big hearing in front of Carl Levin where a lot of swear words were used on TV. The one particular word beginning with an S-H-I-T-T-Y was used, I think, 20 times because of how bankers spoke about these deals. The big argument for why it was okay to sell someone something without full disclosure or without fully telling them your intentions was this idea that they're a big boy, and everyone's a big boy. If they've come to play, they deserve what's coming to them, even if there is a sense of deception or a sense of misleading them. Now, I think a lot about the word fiduciary duty, and this is a word that I think gets thrown around a lot, but the essential meaning of it is when someone is coming to you for advice, if you are bound by a fiduciary obligation, you owe that client or that person the duty of telling them what is in their interest and what is not in their interest. And I think over the time I was on Wall Street, it has morphed into the sense that a fiduciary duty is not owed to anyone. The big problem with that is, I would argue, many, many clients with hundreds of billions of dollars of assets don't understand that. And an example, I'll give you two examples that ultimately led to me writing the op-ed, and I'd like all of you to think about just as an ethical dilemma, especially since we live in a time today where the idea of ethics versus legal are very different things. If something is technically legal and is not going to get you sent to jail, a lot of people will do those things. So the example I would give you to think about is, we recently had a terrible storm, Hurricane Sandy. Everyone gives donations to, say, the Red Cross Society or any other number of charities. I think what the general public doesn't always know is Red Cross, every university endowment, Stanford, Harvard, teachers' pension funds, police pension funds, firemen's pension funds, governments are the biggest fish in the market. They have hundreds of billions of dollars of assets, and they invest them with Wall Street. So what I would ask is, just as a hypothetical example, if the Red Cross Society came to you and asked to trade a very complicated derivative product that was going to pay the firm $20 million, yet you knew was not in their interest, but was not necessarily going to get you sent to jail because the government classifies them as sophisticated, would you do that business? And more, I saw the attitude and the behavior move to a point where, yes, we will do that business because they're a big boy. Now, I would argue it's reached a point where, because of the asymmetric information advantage I've told you about, not everyone's on an even playing field, so more needs to be done to prevent that kind of behavior. The second example I would give you, which is a very powerful one in helping me make my decision to leave, was the European sovereign crisis, which is still boiling, but we may remember last summer or the summer of 2011, it looked like Portugal, Spain, Italy were teetering on bankruptcy. And I would go to trading meetings every morning, and our traders would have a very negative view on the European banks, yet we were being asked to go to some of the biggest investors in the world and try to convince them why the European banks were such an attractive investment, purely because we didn't like the investment and wanted to sell the banks, but we needed someone on the other side of the trade to buy the banks. Now, if we were just talking about some arcane investment that didn't affect anyone, this might not be so relevant, but I would go to my desk and I would see the biggest banks in France and all over Europe moving up and down 5 to 10% a day, not purely, but largely driven by this idea that every 2 days, in order to drum up business, clients at all banks across Wall Street were being convinced today is the day to sell, tomorrow you should buy, now is the time to panic. And the truth is, our traders and traders across Wall Street didn't really believe that conditions were changing on the ground every day. And to me, this started having real real-world impact. There are millions of citizens across Europe who are affected by the fact that their governments can't get their act together, and banks are trying to drum up business in order to make their profits at the end of the quarter. And this ultimately became something that I thought crossed the line of letter of the law versus spirit of the law, and ethical versus legal. And I think it got to a point where I felt this wasn't the type of business that I wanted to do anymore. The final point I'll talk about before I take some questions and answers will be what needs to change in order to fix the system, in my opinion. The one thing I would say, which I don't think a lot of people know necessarily, is that the 5 biggest banks in America are now bigger than they were before the financial crisis. Whatever people claim or don't claim, banks still have an implicit, and I would almost argue explicit, guarantee that whatever they do, the government will support them. Now, just to explain this perverse incentive a little bit, there was an example last summer where a JP Morgan trader who was nicknamed, I think, the giant whale or the London whale, basically took a massive bet, lost $6 billion for the firm, got a wrist slap, lost his job. The person who ran that group, I think over the course of her career, maybe made more than $50 million and left the job. Now, if that loss had been $200 billion instead of $6 billion, the thing that happened to the person who took that trade would be exactly the same. They would get a wrist slap, they would leave their bank, and all of society would have to bail out that bank because of this existing implicit and explicit guarantee that we saw. Anyone who talks about cutthroat free market capitalism, we saw in 2008 when faced with this idea of, are you really going to let the banks fail? The truth is, the government wasn't willing to take that risk and wasn't willing to see what happened. And everyone on Wall Street knows that. And there's now this maximum incentive to swing for the fences, do whatever you can to maximize profits, because if the trade goes bad, you're just going to lose your job. But if the trade goes bad for society, everyone has to bail banks out. And I think what this amounts to today is what I'd call a privatization of the profits and a socialization of the downside risks. And that is absolutely still in force today. Anyone who claims that is not in force is not, in my mind, telling the truth. Now, why is not enough done to fix this? I would, at the very end of my book, I point the finger back at politicians. And the truth is, I think the thing we should all be most outraged about is the fact that, look at the Senate Banking Committee. Who are the firms that are giving them the greatest campaign contributions? It's the Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanleys of the world. Look at the regulators. Look at the hundreds of millions of dollars that have been lobbied in order to kill regulation. And this was very counterintuitive to me, but the way to kill legislation in today's day and age is not to get rid of it or to get it struck from the act. It's to fatten it up. And this wasn't obvious to me at first, but there's a thing called the Volcker Rule, which is designed to completely eliminate proprietary trading, which is banks betting with their own money. It started out as a 2-page document written by Senators Merkley and Levin as an amendment to Dodd-Frank. 2 years later, it's something like 700 pages because banks realized if they can get their law firms to insert hundreds of loopholes and amendments, you ultimately reach a point where the law is so complicated that no one can actually follow it. And essentially, you've achieved this victory where nothing has changed at the end of the day. So I think we need to say to politicians, number one, why don't you have the political will or the guts to actually fix a problem that affects everyone? Banks can still be profitable. They can still do the things that serve society or serve, I would say, economic prosperity, which is raising money, helping companies merge. But when 80% of banks' profits are coming from trading, I don't think banks or politicians are being honest with the public with how their money is being made. And you look at commercials on TV for Citigroup or Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan, you would think they're in the business of helping New Orleans rebuild or about giving money to charities. And certainly there is a significant amount of philanthropy on Wall Street. But I would say to you, the amount of money that's made by helping New Orleans rebuild or investing in urban communities is less than 10%. I think there needs to be a greater sense of honesty where people actually are upfront and say, look, 80% of the money is being made in a business that the public doesn't understand. Frankly, politicians don't fully understand. And I would say to you, regulators are not, I would say, resourced enough or nimble enough to understand things because they're so complex. So what I'm advocating for is a return to the old long-term model where you do business, you make money, your clients make returns, banks can still be profitable, and people who do things that risk, I would say, the systemic safety of the economy are held accountable. And the way to do that, and I'm not a huge fan of regulations, but I think the three big things you need to do, the one is derivatives. You need to bring them back into the light. You need to bring them onto exchanges. Proprietary trading through the Volcker rule, you need to outlaw it. And the law does not have to be 700 pages. The law can be one page. Now, a lot of times banks will hide behind the idea of market making or hedging, which is a more complicated discussion, but I would tell you is a way to hide behind something that still lets you continue to do proprietary trading. And then the third one, which I'm interested to hear what people in the audience think, is about, are banks too big to fail still? And are they too big and too complex to manage? I would say they definitely are. And I would say there's a critical mass building where you don't want to be destructive to banks, but when they're still so systemically dangerous, is there merit to making them smaller, where you split off the trading business from the retail side of the business? And I would argue, yes, there is merit to that. So with those three things, I'll leave it there. And thanks for listening, and I'll open it up for questions.
Just first come, first serve. Is that what it is? Go ahead.
Thank you. Greg, thank you for speaking. It seemed like a lot about what you're talking about was sort of a policy analysis of what the situation is on Wall Street today. But I think a lot of us in the audience are interested, even taking those issues as a given, the way you've described it, from a personal perspective. If we were in your shoes, what is our duty and what is the best way to affect change? So one thing that I noticed was in the years since you first did the op-ed and you attracted a massive amount of media attention, a lot of that momentum seems to have died down over time. There doesn't seem to be the same degree of scrutiny or over Goldman, over Wall Street generally. And it made me wonder, maybe part of it is because by publicly publicizing your reason for leaving Goldman Sachs, even potentially sympathetic employees at Goldman face some sort of pressure to defend the integrity of the firm because they were being attacked from the outside. And perhaps you faced more resistance than you would have had you taken this eternally. So I'm wondering, given the information you know today, if you had to do it all over again, would you think it would have made more sense to have sent the same content of your op-ed, but not sending it to the New York Times, but emailing it to every employee in the Goldman Sachs worldwide directory?
I think that's a great question, and there is a way to send something to everyone in the global directory, which everyone fantasized about at some point. If you mistakenly sent an email to everyone, but no, I think what I would say to you is it took me. I talk about it in the book. I wrote the op-ed over 4 months as I went through a process of having dozens of conversations, first with the people sitting around me, and quietly, behind closed doors, a lot of people on Wall Street feel a sense of angst about the sense that the game could end any day. And I think, everyone I'd say 95% of Wall Street are fundamentally decent people, but I think they're being asked to do things that, as I've been talking about, step over the line of what I think is ethical at times. What I would say to you is I don't think Goldman Sachs is the problem. I think this is a systemic problem. And it's the reason I know the professor was saying Preet Bharara is going to be here next week, and I think there's a real temptation in the public to think that if we send 2 or 3 bad eggs to jail, the problem is going to be fixed. The point I try to get across in my book is this is not a problem about a few bad people making bad ethical decisions. This is about a whole system that doesn't just discourage people to make these decisions, it incentivizes people to make them because their bonus is going to be directly determined by how much they bring in. So after I had conversations to almost head check myself with people that they felt a similar way, I also had conversations with 9 different Goldman partners behind closed doors, half of whom agreed with me about these ethical lapses and longed for a time where you did return to this long-term greedy mentality. But it gets to the point where there's a thing called the golden goose, and as long as it is paying people a lot of money, there's not a lot of incentive to pull the curtain back and to actually change the system. And what I would say to you is there are a lot of people who are in difficult situations, not difficult relative to the world, but there are people who have sent their kids are going to private school. They have all sorts of bills. They're living an expensive life. And by sending a letter to people internally, I could very quickly see through my conversations with people, including a couple of people on the Goldman Sachs Management Committee, and by the way, this I think applies to any firm, there's not a lot of incentive to change something. If you're doing something and you're not going to jail for it and you're not getting into trouble for it, in my opinion, by talking to people about it internally, you are not going to have an impact, because I think this problem is as big as politicians and regulators not understanding the broader problem. So ultimately, I decided I was going to leave, but I did think there'd be merit in trying to say something publicly in order to not destroy the profitability on Wall Street, but maybe return it to a more sustainable fashion. And I'll just give you an example for the business school students here. You look at, is this short-term greediness actually good for Goldman Sachs' business or JP Morgan's business? And I would say to you, I don't think it's good for the business either. And look at how the stock market values banking stocks. Banking stocks are valued at below liquidation value, which tells you that even the market doesn't like this model where there's no predictability, there's no sustainability, there's no long-term orientation. Look at JP Morgan's earnings statement. There is zero disclosure of how the money is made and where it's being made from. And investors can't value companies correctly. So, I just thought there'd be something to be said for saying something publicly. Because I think if people from within the industry don't say something, I think nothing's going to change. And I think we're going to go through the cycle where every 7 or 8 years we have bubbles that expand and ultimately burst. And let's hope that doesn't happen again.
Thank you. Ooh, that's pretty discouraging, isn't it? Greg, you bring out a really good point that says the process of regulation seems to be kind of hopeless. In other words, the big moneyed interests are going to be able to defeat it over time by boring from within, or as the old Romans used to say, who watches the watchers. So it seems to me to have an ethical thing, we have to change the structure. Now, looking back historically, how do you see the move from having these great investment houses move from a partnership to a corporation, and then do you see a correlation of that, the emphasis being on a fiduciary relationship versus a counterparty relationship? Do you see that historically or not?
I see it as being a huge contributor to the problem. And Goldman Sachs was the last large private firm on Wall Street. And when you are a private partnership, your partners' incentives, by definition, are much more aligned with your clients. If you do a deal with the government of Libya and it ruins your reputation and people start pulling their money from your firm, you as a partner are going to feel immediate pain because your capital is tied up. When these firms became public, it became much harder to really take ownership of the problem. And I do think that is an issue. I think it's hard to go back in time and privatize firms, but when they were private, incentives were aligned, and I think clients' interests were better served, and banks were less dangerous because they were less big. The reason banks became public was because of this move in the late 90s by Sandy Weil and others to create these, what I'd call banking supermarkets like a Citigroup, where in order to compete, every investment bank had to get bigger by getting public funding. And if we could go back in time, and I think reverse Glass-Steagall being repealed, reverse derivatives being deregulated, reverse the leverage issues, in my opinion, I don't think we would have had this scandal as bad. I mean, the financial crisis could have still occurred, but I don't think it would have occurred on the same scale. So ultimately, I think the way you fix it now is you point the finger at politicians and regulators and you say to them, we elected you to understand what is going on. If the system is too complex to understand, you need to make that system less complex. If you are being corrupted or unable to be objective because people are giving you money and lobbying and funding your campaigns, the electorate needs to vote those people out of office and say, you know what, this senator is no longer objective. This regulator running the SEC no longer understands what's going on. And I'm just upset that the public isn't more tuned into this issue. And my biggest goal in the way I end the book was really to write this book not for a Wall Street audience or anyone who knows anything about finance, but I would say to write it for people who know nothing about finance, to pull the curtain back to a sense, to show there are a lot of good things that are going on Wall Street, but there are a lot of conflicts of interest. And only if the public holds politicians' feet to the fire will things change. So my hope is that an earlier question was, how can business school students and college students change things? The one is speak to your politicians, hold them accountable, fill yourself in on the issues, and when you do go work in finance, act within your own ethical compass. And one by one, I think people can change things. But I do think politicians ultimately probably harbor the largest amount of blame in this problem.
Hi, Greg. This is a great segue to my next question. What are your plans in the future as far as your career? I think you'd be great in Congress or working for the SEC or the Department of Justice with your background and values. And I'm sure there's people in this room who would support you.
Oh, thank you. Well, I've told some people I'm becoming a DJ, which is not a very popular thing, just as a joke. But no, I mean, in the short term, my plan is to try to bring awareness to, I'd say, the most short-term crisis, which is the fact that Dodd-Frank is dying what I'd call a very slow death by 1,000 cuts. I'm sure everyone tuned into the presidential election. Not one candidate talks about financial reform. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican. There's literally, I would say, one person running for Senate who even mentioned it, who was Elizabeth Warren, who we can agree or disagree about the, I would say, whether her views are accurate or not. But what I do commend her for is that she is talking about it, which I think if it affects people's lives, politicians should talk about it. So I want to be part through giving talks like this to bring a little bit of awareness to what I view as a serious problem. And then longer term, I would like to be helpful to Congress. I would like to be helpful to the SEC. I've been in touch with people in Congress, and I hope to be helpful to them. And in terms of my longer-term plans, I haven't figured it out yet. I think a lot of people said, well, you burnt your bridges on Wall Street, you're never going to work there again. But I think the point I make to people is, that's not what I'm hearing from the public in terms of this idea of returning to a fiduciary standard. Because as I said, the big players in the market are not hedge funds. Hedge funds or rich investors account for less than 5% of the markets. The big players are teachers' pension funds and sovereign wealth funds and mutual funds who hold people's 401ks and donations and retirement savings. So I do think ultimately I would like to be part of the solution in terms of bringing a greater fiduciary standard back to markets. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Earlier in your talk, you mentioned Merrill Lynch and Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns as being three firms that were, over-leveraged and operating in the dark, and they kind of disappeared. Could you give us your thoughts on why Lehman was allowed to kind of burn up and the other two were so-called rescued?
It's a very controversial topic, which I think conspiracy theorists will talk about for a long time. But I think I was sitting on the trading floor at the time that happened, and when Lehman Brothers was allowed to fail, any record checkers or fact checkers should go back and look at the editorials the following day. Both liberal periodicals and conservative periodicals praised Hank Paulson for drawing a line in the sand and saying, you know what, like if you take irresponsible risk and your leaders aren't willing to fix the problem or show the right amount of transparency, you are going to be allowed to die. And ultimately, when the government reversed course on AIG and on multiple other things, I think it just showed a tremendous amount of uncertainty to the markets, and everyone panicked, and that led to more problems. So looking back on it, I think it was a mismanagement in that what markets like, and anyone who invests in stocks will know, markets like consistency. They like to have foreseeability into what's going to happen in the future. And the fact that every day was a guessing game of who was going to be allowed to live and who was going to be allowed to die was a very dangerous thing. So I think perhaps everyone should have been saved, or everyone should have been allowed to die. And I think everyone would have been scared to see what happened, and it's an extreme view, but ultimately, I think history will look back on it, and the crisis probably would have been worse if Lehman, I'd say it's very hard to say, and I would say you need a crystal ball in order to tell. But,
Hi. First of all, thank you for speaking out. I think on Wall Street, a lot of paychecks are dependent on not speaking out. So I wanted to thank you for that. There is precedent for prosecuting people for securities fraud, like in the 1980s during the Keating's savings and loan scandal. Just wanted your thoughts about how or why there have been zero criminal prosecutions of any Wall Street executives. Yeah.
It's an excellent question, and I think a question everyone in America asks. And I'll tell you the reason is quite simple. It's that the laws are not, I would say, of a level that allows criminal prosecutions to take place very easily. And this is what Wall Street wants. Right now, you need to prove criminal intent to defraud people. And you look at any number of examples. You look at the MF Global example, which is a particularly egregious one, where John Corzine, who was the former head of Goldman, and ended up being a senator and a governor of New Jersey. Essentially, $1 billion of money just disappeared. And the reason, or at least the reason Congress will tell the public that no one goes to jail or even gets prosecuted is because in order to prove intent that they were trying to defraud people is a very hard thing to do. So what I would argue, and as I've said, I wouldn't classify myself as a pro-regulation person, but I think any thinking person realizes that if everyone is driving race cars and there are 0 speed limits and everyone is just mandated to self-regulate and to not crash into people, ultimately you're going to get bad actors that crash into other people. So I think the laws need to change and the laws need to be more strict. And the hope was the momentum coming out of the crisis would be used to change those laws. But unfortunately, we're kind of 4 years in the distance. Things are fading into memory. And frankly, that's what banks want. They want this to recede into memory. Personally, I thought the JP Morgan example was something that should have been a much bigger deal because it was very symptomatic of this reckless, we gamble, and if we win, we keep the profits. If we lose, we don't have to worry about it. I think it was an opportunity for Congress to change things. And, Preet Bharara, who will be at the business school next week, has done some great work prosecuting insider trading, which, frankly, right now is what I'd call the low-hanging fruit because it's easy to prove a billionaire used misinformation in order to make some money for himself or herself. The truth is, insider trading doesn't actually affect that many people. The real issue in my mind that the Justice Department and lawmakers should be going after is this systemic issue of, I mentioned earlier, this idea of proprietary trading no longer goes on. What I would tell you is it's absolutely going on. It's just going on under what I'd call a new term, which is hedging or market making. We're doing this in service of clients. The truth is, in my mind and in my opinion, much less is being done in service of clients. Much more is being done by using the fact you're serving clients in order to make yourself smarter to place your own bets. And I just think Congress needs to become a lot smarter at fixing that rule. And if they can fix that rule, I actually think it would be more valuable than sending 2 or 3 people to jail, because the great danger of that is then everyone says, well, we've now fixed the problem. The real problem is much greater than that. It is much more systemic in my mind.
Yes, you mentioned that mutual funds are among the major players in the market. Do these systemic factors that you've mentioned have a significant impact on what I'll call mainstream mutual funds, that invest in equities or fixed income, as opposed to some of the fringe players? And should we as individual investors have any concerns in that area?
Absolutely. And I'll give you a couple examples. I'm sure people remember in May 2010, there was a thing called the flash crash, where the market literally dropped something like 12% in 1 second. And no one could explain what happened. And I think people who had researched the issue speak about a thing called high-frequency trading, which Wall Street firms have computers that get to the stock a millisecond before anyone else, and this causes a lot of volatility. So I would argue mutual funds, no matter how vanilla they are, they're still investing your money in stocks. And if the market can't be assumed to be fair and without uneven advantages, I do think people should be concerned. And I do think your mutual funds should also be held accountable not to use complex products like derivatives when they don't fully understand them, because a lot of the time they don't.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I have a question that's related to some of the answers that you've provided. In I think all of your responses, you've talked about regulations that are instituted and enforced, and then you've also talked about incentives and perhaps disincentives for some of the behavior that exists. I'd like to understand, given the complexity of enforcing regulations and the process that you've advise the audience here, the new grads and the future generation of financiers in Wall Street, what would you recommend on the disincentive side, aside from the sort of the legal consequences of violating the regulations, something that actually relates to the financial rewards? And then in that context, if you could also tell us what differentiates what goes on here in the U.S. versus the European market?
Sure. Good question. I think a lot has been raised about compensation on Wall Street, and I think one of the ways a Wall Street firm will defend paying people $10 or $20 or $30 million is that, well, if we don't do it, they'll just go somewhere else and they'll do it. And I think this is a circular thing that keeps going on round and round and round. And I think if firms decided to bring incentives back in line, things would change. I think the way you do that is you have to tie compensation and incentives to performance of your clients. And you have to tie it to a long-run orientation where you take away the incentive like the London Whale had to swing for the fences because they wanted a big bonus in year one. You have to make compensation based on a 5 or 10 year track record where clawbacks are very strict. They're actually enacted. Yesterday, I'm sure many people saw Jamie Dimon, who's the CEO of JP Morgan, his compensation was cut because of the London Whale incident. And people might say, well, that's a great victory. What I would say is, to me, it's more of a Band-Aid. It's trying to show the public we're doing something. There needs to be a more systemic change in incentives. But the truth is that human nature and greed is something we, as a people, in my mind, cannot regulate. And I think if one had to fault some of the protests that took place around Wall Street, what I think is effective is protest something very simple and factual, like bring derivatives onto exchanges, outlaw proprietary trading. So don't give people the ability to swing for the fences because you take away the products they're using to do that. I think to try to tell people you need to make less money or we're going to cap your pay at X amount or Y amount I don't think jives with American capitalism as I see it. I think people should be able to get rich and should be able to make lots of money. I just think they should be required to do it in a transparent, way that doesn't endanger other people. And I think the easiest solution in my mind is hold regulators accountable, hold politicians accountable, and take away the things that allow people to swing for the fences by regulating the markets more smartly, I would say. In terms of the question about Europe versus the US, Europe, I would say, is more like the Wild West than the US. And the last chapter of my book, when I moved to London, I actually called the chapter the Wild West, because there's very much a greater sense of anything goes. But I would say the US is a leader in a lot of these products, and Europe tends to follow. So if the US can get these laws right, the reason I think banks don't want Congress to pass these laws is they say, well, if we do it here, banks will move to Europe. I guarantee you, if the US changes something, makes the system more responsible, there is going to be a sense of arbitrage around the world where everyone's trying to get somewhere else. But ultimately, the US is the biggest, strongest market in the world, and I think others would follow if we did things a bit better here. Were you next?
Oh, well, go ahead. Greg, in terms of your your second point of the asymmetric nature of information and the casino analogy, when we talk about deposit creation, like it's going on right now, like the last month of last year, there was $220 billion of deposit creation in the U.S. system that's working its way into the fractional reserves, and then the banks are obviously hedging, as you pointed out, possibly not in our best interest. So in terms of that deposit creation in December that's the largest in history, where do you think that money is coming from? And in the casino analogy, who is that person?
I think deposit creation, in a sense, comes from the fact that you look at retail investors and how much they've been investing in the stock market. It's since the flash crash in 2010, it's essentially dropped significantly. So I think there is a sense that people want to just put their money in a bank account and keep it safe to an extent. And I think it's a fearfulness that comes from investing in the market. Now, do I believe that a big bank like a Citigroup or a JP Morgan is necessarily using those funds incredibly recklessly? I don't think so. But do they have hedging groups that claim to be hedging the bank's portfolio but are actually prop trading? Yes, I do. And that was the example of the London whale. So I would hope the system and the stock market becomes a little bit more transparent, where investors don't feel the need to put their money into savings accounts but can actually invest, because that's what's helped the market grow for so long.
You've mentioned a number of banks that have behaved rather badly, but what are the banks that have behaved well, and have they been more profitable than the banks that have behaved badly? If not, then you've got a reversal of incentives.
Yeah, I think you look at the Canadian banks just as an example. They did not have a similar unending leverage. They didn't get into the same complex products, and they weathered the financial crisis just fine. I would say in the U.S., you look at banks like Wells Fargo, they didn't have a similar, I would say, ratcheting up of risk that kept that fiduciary-minded responsibility. You look at some of the more boutique asset management places whose interests weren't all over the place and didn't have all sorts of conflicts, and I think they survived a little bit better. So in retrospect, I think banks like Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and frankly JP Morgan were lucky to survive the crisis, and I think it was a domino effect that was occurring that the government ultimately stepped in and saved. So I think it could have happened to anyone, but the people who weathered the crisis just fine were the ones who retained this fiduciary duty, where they weren't betting against their clients, they weren't using client information to make themselves more money. At the time, they were less profitable, but 5 years later, I would argue they're a lot stronger and on less shaky ground, so to speak.
And in the case of Canada, was it because of any government regulation?
It was. Banks weren't allowed to take 30-to-1 leverage. They weren't allowed to proprietary trade in the same sense. While we as Americans want maximum profit and maximum capitalization, like I was saying, the speed limit topic is relevant. And if you have smart curbs that don't allow you to make 50 times the amount of money, but also don't allow you to lose 50 times the amount of money, I think it's just smarter and safer for the system more broadly.
Thank you. I wanted to say I applaud your courage. That was a great day to post on Facebook your announcement and get feedback from friends and family. You've talked about the ethical and legal dimensions of your decision-making process. Was there this is your token seminarian's question, was there a moral or a religious dimension to that?
A theme that runs throughout my book is I am Jewish, and I do think one's upbringing has some effect on things. And when I talk about the idea of a charity or a philanthropy or a university being charged hidden fees, I do think there is an ethical element that weighs on you, which I think stems from one's religious upbringing. And so I do think it had some impact on me. And I think it goes to this fine line between ethics and legal, which I think there are too many people who are willing to make decisions that are technically legal but not necessarily moral. And I think religion, in my mind, does play a part in that. Thanks for the question. Why don't we take one last question, then we'll wrap it up.
Basically, sort of like a summation. In order to affect change, you have to almost use the KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid. Couldn't you boil down what you're talking about to two items on a macro basis? Repeal of the Glass-Steagall and the derivatives, bring it back to where it was in the Clinton era, because it seemed to have worked for 70 plus years. And secondly, on a micro basis, wouldn't restrictions such as what's happened with Morgan Stanley, where the traders now get compensated in deferred compensation over 5 years, wouldn't that create the disincentives to bet the house for next year's bonus?
Great question. The keep it simple, I completely agree with. The two major regulatory things I'm advocating for are essentially a repeal of the two things that happened in the early 2000s that led to a lot of the problems, which is derivatives being re-regulated, which the CFTC has been sitting on for 2.5 years and frankly has not made a lot of progress achieving. And the second is the Volcker rule, which in a sense is a little bit like many of the things that Glass-Steagall stood for. I mean, there's certainly people who stand for the full repeal of Glass-Steagall. I think there are huge political fears about doing that, but I do think some form of breaking up extremely large banks, disallowing reckless trading activity is noteworthy. I think the thing about compensation and deferring it over 5 years is essential. But does it fix the problem completely? I don't think so. Because the truth is, if you swing for the fence in year one and your bonus, and things don't work out, you can still leave and go to a hedge fund or go do something else. I do think the law actually has to become a little bit stricter, because I think greed and swinging for the fences is always going to be around and is impossible to stop. So I think you actually need to change the root cause, which is, if someone gambles with a client's money or bets against a client, that person potentially needs to go to jail or needs to have some disincentive that's so great that if they're a reckless person, there are going to be 2 or 3 things they think about before they endanger the whole house. So I think laws have to change in addition to compensation changing, but not irresponsible laws, but just ones that create curbs that don't allow reckless activity.
I guess your next talk is to the law school.
I'd love to do it. Well, thank you very much, everyone.
Tomorrow, the Arms Control Association holds